It's just that moment where I wait to make sure the internet has given us permission to have another day. Well, did they give us permission? Did they not? Now it's saying they are, but you know me, I have to see the actual. There it is. There it is. It is here. It is good. It is pretty. Oh, happy day. Oh, happy day. What's up, everybody? Good afternoon. Good evening. Good morning if you're in my time zone. You in my time zone? It's still morning. This is my morning show. I call this my morning show. I know some people are like, Ron, it's 11 a.m. Is that a morning show? Yeah, I'm a comedian. It's a morning show. Anyway, let me give a special thanks to everyone who makes this show possible before I bring in today's guest. First of all, ZT.com, ZHITEA.com. Their tea kind of rules. You can get some of their tea wholesale now because of the pandemic. So check that out. That's ZT.com, ZHITEA.com. I've been obsessed with the raspberry pecan and the white china peach tea. Those are my favorites. ZT.com. Our friends over at triageoil.com, TRIAGE oil.com. They make topical pain oil, cannabis-based topical pain oil that you rub on your body. You guys know it has done wonders for my neck. I had that bad car accident in 2013. My neck will never be the same, probably, but this oil has done more for it than anything else. That's no embellishment. So if you're in the need for some pain oil, do give this a try. Triageoil.com. Trendy Nay makes some amazing pain oil and has a very informative show about cannabis. Also, if you're looking for some ingestible CBD, I got you covered. Rare Naturals with an S, CBD.com. That's Rare Naturals with an S, CBD.com. You can get CBD oil that you can put in your drink. I like to put it in seltzer water. You can put a drop under your tongue. It helps relax you. It's great after an intense workout if you want to soothe your muscles a bit. It helps reduce anxiety. I feel like some of us have some anxiety today. I might be reaching there, but I feel like it's a common thing. And it helps you sleep. Admittedly, I use it for all of the above. It's a great product. I do recommend it. Rare Naturals with an SCBD.com. Here's the best part. Use the promo code Lucy at checkout. That's LUCY, Lucy at checkout. And you get 30% off your order. So if you're already a CBD user, great way to stock up. You get 30% off. And if you're new to the product, want to give it a try, I do recommend it. I use it to help me sleep. I use it to reduce anxiety. I put a little bit in my seltzer water. It just has a natural flavor, and it's great. All right, without further ado, I am so excited to talk to my guest today. I've been trying to get him on the show for a while. His new movie, InterReflections, comes out today. It drops today. And he also is the author of a book called The New Human Rights Movement. We're going to break all that down. And he has a new podcast out called Revolution Now. This man needs no introduction. Please welcome to this show, Mr. Peter Joseph. What's up, Peter?
Hey, Ron. I appreciate having me on, man. Yeah, it's been a while. How you doing?
Yeah, it has. It has. Yes, so I have seen Peter's movie for everyone watching and listening. And it was back in a distant time where we could still gather together in a theater.
Yeah.
Those fun times.
Yep.
So congratulations, first of all. The movie dropped today. I think you should be happy, right?
Yeah, I had some problems last night. I have to preface my conversation with you to say that I'm running on fumes right now. So if I'm a little slow or inarticulate, just have some compassion. I'm very tired at the moment. Yeah, the January screening, I was really happy that you came and everyone that came to that. But it was a little premature for the completion of the film. It was a very complicated project. So here we are many months later. But the final version is good. So I'm very proud of the quality that was executed in it, and anyone can watch it now in numerous venues. So I hope people check it out.
Well, I really enjoyed it, and I also saw how it connects to the New Human Rights Movement book. Now, for anyone who may not have read the book or seen the film yet, it does connect to the book, but it connects to the book. Not in the literal sense when you see a movie and a book connecting. The New Human Rights Movement is not a fictional book by any means. It is not, there's not really science fiction in that book, but the movie kind of adapts the themes from the book and has like a science fiction element to it. And I thought it was a really fun way you connected it, but kind of just explain what all that is about for anyone who's not familiar.
In terms of the film itself or the book?
Both.
Okay, so the book was written in, excuse me, the book actually was written in the middle of the process of the production of InterReflections. And I realized that my themes were so concurrent that I just decided to base it directly on it because, I've been talking about the same kind of thing for years. So when most people, when they make a movie based on a book, there's usually some kind of narrative or something, or if you make an intellectual academic book, as the new human rights movement is, okay, you make a documentary about it. But I wanted to do something more creative. At heart, I really have a strong artistic drive, and that's kind of how I even got into this world. Was when I produced a performance piece years ago called Zeitgeist, and love it or hate it, that film was literally an artistic creation that was not designed to be a documentary. In fact, it was a live performance piece. So this has been part of my world. I'm a classical musician by trade from years ago. It seems like a distant reality, but that's my home. So I said to myself, I want to do something creative. I want to do something that's out of the ordinary, something avant-garde, experimental. I've always been deeply influenced by, of course, the greats like Stanley Kubrick, and then in more modern times, Aronofsky. And particularly in this film, my inspiration was David Lynch. Even though most films by David Lynch, you wouldn't probably see the exact relationship, but his use of avant-garde and that kind of destabilization I really liked. So I don't want to jump too far ahead, but the book is about what I call a structuralist approach to problem solving for society, which is not considered a political approach. It's not an ideological approach. It's a social science and a sociological approach. And we can talk more about that if you want. So when I constructed the film, which, by the way, I really made as a passive, was really conceived as a passive project. I'd never intended to spend 5-6 years making this thing. But as I got into it, as I wrote it, it got bigger and bigger and more ambitious. And you shoot a film that's 80% green screen. For those out there that do film production, they can understand, a low budget filmmaker, the problems that arise with such a thing. I thought I was being smart about it. It's like, oh, I'm going to make a film on green screen. That's easy. I know how to do this, because that's what I used to do when I lived in New York. I worked at an advertising company, and we shot things on green screen all the time years ago. And I miscalculated the amount of work that actually goes into that. And that's why this thing has been delayed for as long as it has. So the film itself is broken into 3 different structures. You have this kind of modern day horror movie silent film that follows a character named 23. That's her imposed name. It's not really her name. You don't really know what her name is. It doesn't matter. And she moves through these different vignettes as she gets fired from her job. And it's a very hallucinatory experience with her character. And then the mid-tier layer, if you will, follows this the core theme of the film, which will carry over into the sequels if I ever have the patience or money to make them, is a science fiction satire, which is the fundamental, again, core narrative of the film, which has a cliche protagonist and antagonist named Simon and John. Michael Marinaccio is the actor, and Gregory Nebel is the actor. They did a great job. And they have this debate in space about basically what we are debating right now, but in a far more detailed way with 2 different worldviews. So the antagonist character is basically supporting a social Darwinistic view. There are themes of, Thomas Malthus and Thomas Hobbes and these old philosophers that believe that humans are just basically animals and we're at war, and we shouldn't even try to define peace or even seek balance. We're just going to be animalistic groups battling out into eternity. So that's an important theme throughout the entire thing, which is basically what that entire science fiction element is, at least in its core narrative. And then, of course, I want to give spoilers for the film, but then it moves into a very big climax and finale of the film, and all this stuff happens that I won't go into on that narrative. And then the top tier narrative, so to speak, which is sort of the most documentary of it all, are 4 academics of the future 100 years from now. And they are talking about what society is today. They're giving that hindsight, which I always thought was a very powerful device, where you put the audience in a position of future hindsight. They always say hindsight's 20/20. So I try to use that and see if I could kind of rope the audience into feeling a little bit different about their normalized world by putting them in that position. So that's your basic summary of the film.
So getting into the theme of what you define as a structuralist society, like in the book and then in the movie, there's this theme of, here's a different way to go about a society that you're not really taught about in school, it's not really within the confines of what we deem to be the acceptable realm of conversation in our contemporary political and social sphere. So how would you unpack like what the new human rights movement is?
So you mentioned a structuralist society. I'll just clarify to say the structuralist term, it's not related to an historical term, which is a completely different definition. I coined that just because it's about systems. It's not a society, it's about an approach to understanding and solving problems with it. So all a structuralist approach is saying, what is the root cause? How deep can we go in the causality of our lives, the incentives that make people do things, the structures that pocket activity? You know, we have an economic system where you have to do certain things in order to survive and so on. So how deep can we go to figure out where the roots are? And ultimately that's a sociological perspective, needless to say. And it's kind of funny to me how ignorant people are of sociology in the modern day. Some people almost can't conceive of it at all. And I think the reason is because the difference between a psychological and a sociological perspective is a sociological one requires it requires people to admit that they're not entirely in control of their behavior. In other words, if you take a population level view of, say, school shootings or mass shootings in America, this is probably the best example. First of all, why have we had, up until COVID, because COVID disrupted everything, did we average a mass shooting a day in America on average over the course of years? What is that? What the hell is going on? Now, we don't know who that person's going to be necessarily, but we know it's going to happen. So you have a statistical population level phenomenon that can be analyzed and understood eventually in terms of its sociological roots, which I won't go into in terms of that particular phenomenon, but just that awareness. So you have a statistical distribution of people that commit what we call crime. You have a statistical distribution of subdeterminants of crime, poverty. In fact, I would just jump into that one. Poverty is the greatest form of systemic discord of probably anything. I mean, inequality itself, as I think you understand, as many should understand out there today. Excuse me, again, I'm very tired, so if I'm stumbling, just bear with me. Statistically speaking, inequality is the most dangerous social condition you can have, and epidemiologists have officially said that. In my third film, Zeitgeist Moving Forward, I interview the former head of violence, the study of violence at Harvard University, Dr. James Gilligan, a brilliant man who's written about this. And his core statement, after interviewing for years really vicious murderers and serial killers and studying violence as a prison psychologist, not to mention an academic, he said, the greatest thing you can do to reduce human violence is to reduce inequality, reduce socioeconomic inequality. So this is the kind of stuff that my book gets into. And when you take that kind of view, once again, you start to see how pathetic our political views and the ideologies and the loyalties that people have concocted, how ignorant people are of their own behavior, how they don't really understand the causality. We have a free will delusion. And I'm not saying that people don't have volition and obviously should be held with moral and ethical responsibility. Obviously, we have that. But until we see the lowest causality of this as to why the crime and the corruption, and why is it that the really wealthy tend to lean towards psychosis? And this has been studied at UC Berkeley. Why is it that people, when they get more and more money, they actually get more and more entitled on average? They actually become more and more apathetic. And there's clear psychological reasons for that. And then there's reasons that are not so clear that take advanced study that you would never really piece together unless you took a sociological perspective. So I've jumped around here a bit, but the structuralist worldview that I try to put out there, which is my core, argument, is to say, at the end of the day, the conclusion that's reached in the New Human Rights Movement book, and ultimately is throughout my film, you have to change the economy. The economy is the root of most of the aberrancies that we're seeing on multiple levels. And it's not about capitalism and communism or socialism. This completely scientific worldview to say this is unsustainable. This doesn't work. We are in complete collapse, slow motion collapse, like burning a frog. Burning a frog, like boiling a frog. We're watching the ecosystem slowly deteriorate on every single level, and everyone's throwing their hands up like, well, I don't know what's going on. We have these huge meetings all over the world about biodiversity loss. We've lost almost 70% of all animal species over the past 60 years. When we talk about the climate change stuff, which should be pretty much obvious to everybody else, topsoil, and these international meetings happen, and what do they not talk about? They don't talk about the economy. Because why? That's what's put food on the table. They're psychologically inhibited by the fact that we can't possibly change very system that feeds us. I mean, what else would we do? Oh, we can't go to communism. Look at what happened. So you see the dynamic and how paralyzed we've become. And that's pretty much my activism. That's all I do. And I don't jump around. I just keep focused. My new podcast, Revolution Now, is all about that. That's all I talk about. And eventually, hopefully, talking about kinds of activism that will transcend this. I don't believe in the political form of activism. I don't believe in any of the political parties. I think there is a nuance to it you have to pay attention to. I do believe you need to get rid of Donald J. Trump because he is a cancerous psychology that is far more dangerous than I think people realize. It's not a partisan issue. But in the end, I support a strong structuralist change, which means a complete revolution of the economy.
So you got into a lot of topics that I wanted to jump to next, and this is kind of going into some of your podcasts too a little bit. You have, you have given a critique of contemporary activism, and you mentioned, and I'm paraphrasing here, but I think the way you kind of put it is you said, a lot of people, they're just struggling so much that they don't really have the bandwidth to turn and listen to the activists. But you also really highlight the importance of, kind of a re-education on a lot of different issues. So what's kind of a better activist approach then?
Okay. That's a big topic because it's going to have to be a combination of things. See, I look at it in multiple tiers. So I don't put people down for, causing, making noise in the street with signs and the general protest. I think what we aren't seeing anymore, which was very successful in the 1960s civil rights movement, is true civil disobedience. We see pockets of anger, such as the unbelievable, riots and so on that happen due to police brutality. But it's not strategic, of course. So you have that level, and I think that's fine. But that's sort of like the beginning level. The true form of activism, as I see it, is literally a design think tank project that gets people together to first accept the fact that we have to change the underlying structure of our society. And again, not falling back onto communism and socialism and all of those esoteric myths ultimately in people's minds. No one can even define those terms if you really question them about it. But to do something that actually engineers true change from the ground up. And the way I see it ultimately occurring, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but I'm just going to go ahead and say it. I don't believe that there is going to be a top-down regulatory change on this planet. I think this power systems are so corrupted that by the time they realize what they really have to do in terms of stopping a market economy, for example, that's based on infinite growth and this terrible hierarchical system of inequality, which creates more and more discord between the species, by the time they realize that, it's going to be far too late. So I encourage people, and again, I'm jumping way ahead, because I'm going to talk about this on my podcast, to start developing new systems internally. So to create a revolution within the system using advanced technologies that can supersede, that can override the general infrastructure that we come to be, fundamentally starting to get rid of the use of money in internal communities through many different avenues, networks of time banks. You have all sorts of sharing systems, tool libraries, supporting people to go out and actually create agricultural projects with advanced technology, not just lo-fi, planting seeds in some community garden, but getting investment to localize communities where people start to just get off the grid. Just like your house can be off the grid, you don't have to worry about utility bills and so on. This is what communities need to start doing, and actively so. And I think if that spreads, the logic will happen. Eventually, you get a country to get off the grid that will actually use sustainability principles and the protocols that I speak of at length in my book. That is the way I see real activism developing. Stop yelling. Stop telling the politicians what to do. Stop complaining. It's not going to go anywhere. You'll knock out a few things here and there. You might get some legislation to help this and that, but the system is so. It's like a big river, and it's all political economy is a market-based reality. The politicians are fundamentally bought, even if they don't know it, because of the condition that they find themselves. It doesn't matter what they say, just the fact that they're in this reality. And the United States, of course, is the pinnacle of it. We are the ultimate example of everything that could possibly go wrong with the value systems inherent to fundamentally capitalism, to the market system of economics, to the pursuit of growth and expansion, the proxy reality of profit versus intent. Think about this. We don't do things because of intent. We don't want to solve problems directly. We think, oh, I'm going to have to make something to make money. And then if it has a positive effect on society, well, good. That's great. That's the way our entire problem solving mechanism is. It's insane. So again, I'm rambling on here, but that kind of summarizes my position on activism. I support all levels. You can lobby, you can do the protests, but until you begin to join a community and design and start to build new systems that transcend the current one, I think we're going to be in a whole lot of trouble. As ambitious as that sounds, by the way. And I'll add one more thing. If I do end up making the trilogy to this film, that's precisely what the communities do as this trilogy advances and into reflections. But I won't go into all of that.
So, a couple things. Do you think that, getting to what you said, where it's like, yeah, the politicians, they don't even know that they're bought because they're participating in this, in the realm in which they find themselves. Do you think that there's kind of a stigma in the United States in particular? I would say it's worldwide too, but really in the United States in particular, where we don't recognize systemic problems as such?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because that gets to the heart of a certain psychological inhibition. If you look at the whole of the evolution of knowledge, the science of epistemology, we have moved from deeply superstitious views, of course, to, by the time of the Enlightenment, at least a semblance of understanding of the scientific nature of causality. But it's still very, very counterintuitive. Everything that we see and feel, very often, very rarely do people have intuitions that are deeply acute, but it's always wrong. Everything we see is wrong. What we perceive with our five senses is simply not the way the world actually is. And when we look at causality, I debate libertarians all the time, and they have this idea of coercion and violence. So they say, oh, well, no one's putting a gun to your head to make you buy something. Why do you think the system of market economics is violent? Well, because people are actually structurally, broader speaking, in a systemic sense, put into a position of servitude by the structure. This kind of servitude exists in the coercion of the structure. And they can't conceive of that because it's just too wide for their lack of education. No one teaches this stuff in school, and the most deeply inhibited area is politics and the basic human dynamic, the human condition. Excuse me, the day-to-day reality. We can see the science of causality and the ecosystem. We understand the hydrological cycles and all those things that we understand. We understand things are linked and all that. But when it comes to the human condition, people just blinker out. They can't handle it. And I think that's a fundamental inhibition, not only in our intuition, but also the way we think. We think categorically. I mean, everything that comes out of my mouth are words. Words are categories. They're boxes of other ideas. Someone used the word like capitalism. Like, well, that is an enormous word. Like, how do you break that word down to understand what it really means? Meaning that we're categorically locked, and you have to really stop and really educate yourself on systems science, which is, I guess, the fundamental, discipline here. All science is systems based. I mean, if anything that deals with scientific causality has a system element, meaning that you have to understand interconnecting and overlapping aspects. This is all needless to say. I'm sure people think this is kind of redundant, but if you really dig deep in all the policies, the legal policies have no regard for this. When they arrest somebody for something, they look at it as a completely individualistic free will thing. But if you take a longitudinal approach, longitudinal studies that look at crime statistics in different regions with different preconditions where people exist, like inner cities that are poor, you see a distribution of this crime that's very, very consistent. So therefore, it can't be just free will volition. There's something else happening. So people have a very hard time with that. So that's the fundamental cognitive inhibition. And then you have just the fundamental traditions that people get locked into in their comfort zones. Religion, I always have tolerance for religious belief. I mean, it's just still pretty much insane that people still, we have a person that's being nominated to the Supreme Court.
I feel like you might have made a movie about this before.
Yeah. We have a person literally that's considered a high intellectual mind that's supposed to make amazing judgments about the future of American civil law. And she is an insane religious fanatic and basically a cult subsect of Catholicism. Her belief system. I mean, how can you think about the bizarre that is, that our intellectual integrity in this country in the Supreme Court is revolving around these people that literally believe in things that can absolutely not be proved with no reason, logic, or whatsoever. So anyway, that's a traditional inhibition that once again feeds into this free will notion. So, going back to the crime issue, that's a great example. It's probably the best example. And I pretty much forgot what your other question was. So can you remind me?
Well, we were talking about how people don't identify,
Right.
systemic problems as such, which I do think it's a theme we really need to come around to. And I can bring up so many micro examples, just that I inherit in my daily life, where it's like, hey, Ron, you talk about the corporate media and how it's not a good thing. I have a buddy who works for CNN doing XYZ. I'm sure you'd get along with them. And it's like that's not the point.
Right.
We're talking about a structural problem. One of the most common cliches people throw out there, like, well, not all cops are bad. That's not the point. It's a structural problem. It's a structural problem. And politicians like, well, I like so-and-so in district whatever. Yeah, but it's a structural problem. And even if they have well intentions, they're probably going to be redistricted at the end of the day. Actually, that's usually how it works.
Yeah, right. Look at the, of course, systemic racism. I mean, this word has now been thrown around by so many people for the past year, and with good reason. I'm glad to hear people say it, but almost no one knows what they're saying. I mean, they don't know what systemic racism actually means. It's this overlapping historical unfolding that's happened since the slavery period in America, where this step-by-step process of cultural shifts and then incentives. And as Martin Luther King pointed out, just to go into this to a little bit of detail, after the Civil War, that's when the racism really, really began, because the free, poor Black people are now in direct economic competition with the existing poor white people in the South. And if you look at trends across the country, or excuse me, across the world, in Italy or any of these nations, or Ukraine versus Russia, if you interview and see the polls on this, everyone hates each other due to economic reasons. In Virginia, for example, because I'm from North Carolina and I knew people in Virginia, and believe it or not, before NAFTA, where people from Mexico and Latin America started to come to the United States, everyone in lower West Virginia hated everyone from northern West Virginia because they were taking all the jobs. So you see this pattern throughout. And this is unfortunately the most deep-rooted element of systemic racism. It's rooted in economic fear, but it's not immediate economic fear. It's a culturally developed pattern from that fear over the course of many generations. And suddenly people have forgotten why they're even racist. And it becomes, takes on a life of its own. So that's a little bit on that subject. But again, as you point out, this is a huge lapse in our educational system, huge lapse. And I think, frankly, people see it as very unromantic. They think, well, if this is true, if there is causality on this level, again, I must not be as free in my own volition. And there's nothing wrong with understanding that you are stuck in a kind of position of causality where, yeah, you have some degree of free will, but yeah, you are also deeply influenced by what has happened in your childhood, by what goes on around you, and of course by the structure of the society and what it incentivizes. So let's jump back again to systemic change. Mm-hmm. Do you think a general strike would help? Yeah, I've always encouraged a huge mass strike against this system, particularly the economic attributes that are the most detrimental. But the thing is, the fear of people losing their reputation and everything that goes along with being a proactive activist gets in the way. The system is very much locking people in. It's a little bit rare right now that we're seeing so many protests. It's because of COVID, because people are actually unemployed. You would not see so many people hitting the streets for all these causes if it wasn't for that fact. They would be, just locked into their bubbles. The system kind of has everybody by the balls, so to speak. Everyone is structurally limited. The lower and poor, the middle class and the poor naturally have the most to fight for, but they're also the ones that are so in debt. They're also the most structurally oppressed. They can barely think past, feeding their family and taking care of themselves and trying to be healthy. So I've always been in favor of mass strikes. That would be a good wake up. But here's the difference. If people don't know what they want after the strike, then what's the point? Look at all the energy spent on the police protests. Nobody really put forward a policy that described what to do. Defund the police is the most vague thing that you could put out there, and of course has been completely turned upside down, and people completely misinterpret what was meant by that. You should demilitarize the police. There's a great policy, but that hasn't happened. There has to be something a little more concrete. And what I hope to do, in the best I can, I'm working on a kind of a white paper, a peer review style paper that takes a sociological view of social change. And I'll be talking about this on my podcast, and hopefully inspire people to come together and work on an actual change project that isn't just anger. It isn't just protest, but literally a step-by-step kind of recipe to get more people on board with what's required. I think you can have rapid change in this society, but everyone has to be on the same page, and no one is on the same page. And you can pretty much blame the ridiculous pluralism in our political lunacy for that. Again, coupled with the fact that people just aren't educated on any of these issues.
Well, no, I hear you there, because I mean, one of the things I did, and again, it's just my take on things, but so many people said, well, what do you mean, Ron? What do you want systemic change to the idea of policing in our lives? What do you mean by that? So I actually did sit down and I just wrote a piece saying, okay, if I was mayor of, Newsville, here's what I would do. This is exactly what I would do. And I laid out what I would change and what I would do. And I basically said, at the end of the day, I'm completely reinventing what it means to have law enforcement in our lives. And I'm sure this system I'm proposing would not be perfect and would have flaws, but it would be a hell of a lot better than this insane system that we have now. I mean, like, why? And, a mutual friend of ours, Lee Camp, has a great joke in his act about just like, it's insane that this job even exists. A police officer as we know it. It's just an insane thing.
It's horrible. It links back to the early slave patrols, as I'm sure you know. Authority has a lot of deeply dark roots in this way. If you want to stop, well, here's what I would say in terms of police brutality. First, there is this precondition of poverty and inequality, once again, that does unfortunately produce a certain statistical amount of aberrancy. So you do have people committing so-called crime, but it's because of the economy. People like to argue, say, well, you can eliminate all crime. Well, yeah, so what? You could eliminate probably 95% of it if you actually had a system that supported people and then forced them into coercive submission to corporations and each other. And you literally had a society that cares about you. We've been propagandized for forever. Oh, the nanny state. Well, you can't take care of yourself. What is the point of the state? What's the point of government, I should say, because people hate those words. What is the point of management of society? We have all these resources that's abundant earth. We could do so much with a redesign that takes care of people, and people would actually be free. And everyone hates this like communist socialist thing. Say, well, I want my freedom. Well, you want your freedom to be a slave? You want your freedom to be in debt? You want your freedom to be able to, to have a gun because you have to protect yourself because you might get robbed because of the society that we live in is so unstable. So all of that is so convoluted. I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. I was going to say something else. Again, I'm very tired. Continue.
No worries. So, well, I actually wanted this question kind of jumps a little bit into what you were saying about the peer-reviewed paper. And this is more like a kind of the world of Peter Joseph type question. What is your relationship with academia?
I went to, I'm just self-taught. I like to read. That's pretty much it. I was a classically trained musician. I was very fortunate in my late middle school age at 14 to be accepted into a college university for music. And I stayed in that institution until I graduated at high school level. And then I moved to New York City and went to a music conservatory there, went into an enormous amount of debt. I say, you know what, I'm not doing that. And I just started to, do contractual things with, music and video. And I just read. That's pretty much it. That's all it really takes. With intent, obviously. I'm very strategic in what I choose to read and spend my time on. And I can't think of anything more fascinating than understanding human society. Why are we doing what we're doing? How did we get here? How can we get out of it? So, and I think everyone needs that side of them. That's another thing. I have this term I call the bubble people, and it's the people that have been docile. They think that the world is like I think America is like the late 1950s, where the boomer generation, the world's in wreckage. You have the middle class. Everyone's like, oh, why can't we just get the middle class back and all this? They don't understand that things keep changing and becoming more and more inequality based, whether it's globally or whether it's domestically. So this whole notion of make America great again, it's not just a slogan that Reagan actually invented. Trump just imitated him. It harnesses this delusion that the positivity of something comes from behind. We have to go back to something. And I think anyway, what the hell am I talking about? Excuse me.
I was listening. I was into it.
Okay. Well, see,
Well, I
you see
guess
my point.
the second part, of that question, like what I was curious about.
Yeah.
Do you get contacted for, say, lectures or to collaborate on different publications, like by the academic world? Is that a thing that
No.
happens for you?
I mean,
No.
I was not really. No, I've done 2 TEDx talks. There was a period where I just went around and did lots of talks and events that we held with the Zeitgeist movement and stuff like that. And I haven't done that in quite some time. And I was actually, believe it or not, on a list. One of my publicists connected me with an agent out of the UK to be at a lecture circuit, and then she contacted me some months later, said, "Sorry, no one's interested in you," which is understandable because the kind of thing I talk about would be perceived as so incredibly radical. You're not going to see someone on a TED talk about the need to eviscerate this kind of economy. You're not going to see that kind of yet. Now, I'm hoping as the awakenings with all of this stuff like COVID inspires people to start thinking we have to do something different. I mean, it's out there. People are talking about the system change. They don't know what they're talking about really, but they talk about system change and whatever definition they've come up with, seeing that we have to do something about the ecological crisis, and we have to do something about the public health crisis generated by socioeconomic inequality. But you won't not see any of the major institutions, academia, universities really have the courage to come out and say, this is an economic problem at its sociological root. It's still taboo. It's still taboo.
Do you think that's a huge problem?
What?
Well, everything you just said. I mean,
of course,
academia is supposed to challenge preconceived notions. What's the point of the academy if not to do that?
Yeah, I hear you. I mean, think about universities. They have a rote kind of unfolding. The recipes of this kind of humanities, the disciplines, they very rarely change. It's been the same basic structure since the Industrial Revolution. We're basically engineering humans to think, to be workers in that kind of old world. There's some exceptions, of course, but it's also very compartmentalized. So, you look at look at these scientists that are so brilliant, people from MIT, sociologists, and I just can't understand how they can't pick up on the fact. I mean, I know it sounds arrogant of me, but how can they not see the root of these issues? How can they not say, come out, a notable person like Neil deGrasse Tyson, why can't he come out and say, you know what, we got a serious problem with our economy. It's based on infinite growth and cyclical consumption. It can't work unless people buy and consume and consume. That's not very scientific if we want to be sustainable on this planet. You don't hear that. You don't hear that from any of these people. And I've been a very vocal critic. I mean, the only person that came close was Carl Sagan. I miss Carl Sagan so much because he's the only one that really kind of had the courage to just say what everything needed to be said. And if he was around today, he would probably be a greater savior than he was back then, because he would have the courage once again, particularly regarding the economy. And he was talking about climate change, way back before anybody else was. The science of what's happening in our atmosphere through greenhouse gas emissions. So yeah, I'm very disappointed. Very disappointed. I mean, it takes a musician like me and a rogue group of people to start talking about this subject when the advanced scientific thinking community needs to be out there just stating this outright. It's not that hard to do. And the reason they don't do it is because of their reputation. It's the compartmentalization of their jobs. And the only person that the only other person that seems to say these kinds of things is Dr. Robert Sapolsky out of Stanford University. Robert has been very outspoken against the criminal justice system. I interviewed him in my third film as well. He's the only one that has the courage. He literally speaks about the fact that we should not have these prison structures. People are not responsible for their crime in the way that the prison system perceives it. So, he's another rare exception, but very few and far between, I'm sorry to say.
So you got into climate change, which is on my list of things I wanted to talk with you about. And on the podcast, you've talked about climate change. And I think one of the thoughts that we share is I have zero confidence in our federal ability to really do what needs done. I just don't have any confidence. I do have a little confidence in our local ability, and hopefully that will then transition into a state ability.
Yeah.
But where my hope lies is that I'm hoping other countries will lead the way. You mentioned on your podcast that your hope kind of lies, and correct me if I'm getting this wrong, but your hope kind of lies in technology. Could you unpack that a little bit?
Well, I would say actually it's more of a fallback.
Okay.
Technology is important. That's in a way that's the race we're in. It's like this donkey that's just plowing forward, just shitting all over the place. And technology is the thing with the scooper trying to pick up the shit that keeps coming out of the donkey. So we're in a race with our own technological advancement against our system, which is completely and utterly corrupted. Corrupted meaning it doesn't work to begin with. It's incompatible. So the technological solution is not the true solution. It's what I say needs to happen because we're too far down the road. Even if you stopped all emissions right now, it's still super messed up out there. It would take years to recover, and it's not going to happen. And we did see with COVID, at least, the sky started to clear up in Asia. You saw like a little hint of the ecosystem returning, at least the atmosphere returning to some balance. But of course, industry starts back up, economic growth starts back up. So the reason the reason governments don't do it is because the entire foundation of governmental support is based on economic growth, whether through taxation or just the fact that they are really a business entity. Government in this kind of economy is ultimately a business entity. And people don't really pick up on that. And of course, the United States is the biggest exaggeration of that, but it's the same throughout the world. So business dominates. It's how these nations keep moving. So you're not going to see that kind of change, and they'll keep talking about it and giving lip service to it. But all of these COP21 and the Kyoto Protocol, they accomplish nothing. What do they do every single time? They say we need a guarantee. Even in Canada, there was a couple of years back, they tried to impose some fines on Canada because they were violating their carbon emission standards. And literally the Canadian Prime Minister just pulled out. He just said, I'm sorry, we have to worry about our economy. I'm not going to participate in this anymore. Look, and that's exactly the way Trump thinks. And all of these guys actually think deep down. So to clarify, technology is going to have to be used. We have to find ways to use technology to clean up the environment as fast as we can. But that's clearly a race that we're not going to win at the current trajectory. If we have the same methods of industry and we're not, in California, like, we're going to have cars that aren't powered by gas in 15, 20 years. Why not 1 year? Why not? Because you can do that if people care. But the reason is it's an economic transition. That's why the oil industry continues its powerful lobbying. They want to keep their market share. They're not willing to make these shifts, which they could have done literally 50 years ago if they wanted to. They have to do it incrementally because they have to maintain their market share. So this slow grind is going to keep wearing away this civilization. Same goes for socioeconomic inequality, in fact. But anyway, I won't go on that tangent. So yeah, technology is important because we have to fix the problems we're creating, but it's not the solution.
Well, what are some technological advancements that you are kind of hopeful for, like, when it comes to climate change?
Yeah, in terms of the Bill Gates and some others have pondered this mechanism that can pull the carbon out of the air and then store it underground. So I think that's probably going to happen. I think in buildings, for example, they incorporate this kind of extraction system from the atmosphere. You could build it into the infrastructure, and obviously you have to have structural change still, but that could at least slow things down a little bit. So that's one thing. That's probably the best thing actually you can hope for. You have to have a mechanism that can just start taking this out. The trees, there's other slower processes. If you reforest a lot of places, as you might know, it will suck in a whole lot of CO2. The fact that we continue deforestation is just insane, especially right now. So that's the core one for that. There's lots of other technological solutions for all the other ecological problems. Let's remember, climate change is just one of the severe ecological problems, just one. There are many others.
So let's switch to the economy a little bit. You have spoken on your podcast about how, money is fake, and you talk about the monetary system. But one of the things you also mentioned is you're not a fan of MMT, which I thought was a little fascinating, because sometimes when you speak about money, you kind of sound like some of the MMT scholars I have listened to, and then you go, well, but I'm not a fan of MMT. So can you kind of unpack that some for me?
Well, so MMT is it's a perspective. It's an interpretation of the financial system. First of all, when I say I'm not, excuse me, I say I disagree with it. I don't disagree with the theory per se. I disagree with what people are trying to do in terms of policy. I think it's just a very weak thing to approach, to say, well, yeah, governments can make big governments can make infinite amount of money to solve their problems. Well, think about how preposterous that is from a fundamentally it's a self-contradiction. I can't think of the word to describe it. It's like we're willing to accept the ultimate contradiction of the market economy by saying, well, since governments can make money out of nothing, which is preposterous and not the solution, let's just do that and have infinite debt. The contradiction of the debt creation, the fact that you can have a permanent deficit in a government and somehow that's a good thing, is to me ridiculous, because it's saying that the system is fundamentally an illusion. So if you recognize that, then why not go a deeper length? Why not make actual projects that can remove effectively the money in use? Because that's what I support. I think MMT as a theory, and the guys that have talked about it, has a great internal logic. It's very fascinating the way people think about it and talk about inflation, the reversal of it. I think the guy Mosler, he's talked in great eloquence about the issue, but I just find it to be an intellectual exercise. I don't see how they can put it into practice. I mean, I've seen people make these activist lists. They say, well, we do this and then that and then that and that and that. And we have the first world have a constant running deficit, so we can use this money to do this, this, and this. And what they don't realize, they're just suggesting a policy that has to be approved by somebody in some government. And who's going to approve something like that? I'm against that kind of policy orientation. I'm not saying that policy shouldn't be put into practice. We should try our best to solve problems with whatever mechanism possible in the government that we exist in, but that can't be what we depend on at this stage. It's just undependable. So does that make sense? I appreciate the theory and approach. I understand money is fake. I understand that, yeah, if the United States wanted to solve all homelessness and poverty, they could run the printing presses and do it. Yeah, they could do it right now, but they choose not to. And they justify it by the internal logic of the household economy, even though they can do otherwise. But your household economy means you actually save, you actually control your debt. You do things in the traditional logic of a conservative economic to economize, as it were. So I find it preposterous as a policy suggestion. But I think the theory illuminates something that's very important, and that's the fact that it's all bullshit. It's all bullshit. Money has no relationship to anything. If you wanted to have a true market economy, the money would have to have a value directly determined by the goods and services and resources of the planet. There would have to be an equation where the amount of money produced had to actually mirror the value inherent to the earth. And you could do that, but no one's doing that. It's nonsense. Even go back to gold standard, you got these Ron Paul people still out there. They don't seem to realize that no one actually used the scarcity of gold in any actual mathematical way. It was, again, just an illusion. Okay, it's a precious metal for whatever reason, and it seems to be in finite supply, so we base it on it. Still has no relationship to the Earth's resources, has no relationship to the power of humanity to do work. So this term resource-based economy is something I've talked about for years, and what it means that you have to have an economy that's rooted actually in the valuation of the planet and its capacity, in its limitations simultaneously in terms of sustainability. So I hope that helps explain why.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely does. I mean, it's but what do you think it would take for this kind of societal shift? Like, and just bullet points, because I know that could be an hours long answer, and I'm not asking you that. That's too much. But
that's actually, I can summarize it pretty straightforward. In fact, the move is to get out of the market economy, and as incremental or as large as step you can. So you know, this term nationalization, I hate to use this word because it implies, state authority, but imagine, as we can do right now, instead of globalization for food, you localize food production with advanced technologies such as hydroponic systems and vertical farms. Very low energy, very low resource needs, very high output for many different kinds of vegetation and so on. You localize this and you put them in the community and you make it so efficient. Like, I'm in Los Angeles, I'm in a place called Culver City. You could have these in the area, and people that live here, they are the ones that have access to the fruits of that production right there localized. And it's so efficient, no one needs to pay for it. It's built in. It's a community-driven effort. You do the same thing with energy. Finally, we get all the energy on people's energy grid, solar and everything else on people's homes and structures. Suddenly, the community has its own self-creating energy system that is so efficient, nobody needs to pay for it. So you get rid of paying for food. You get rid of paying for energy, transportation, automated car systems. You don't need everyone to have a car. It's completely wasteful. Cars sit for 96% of their lives anyway. It's preposterous that we have this idea that everyone should just own a car, especially now with automated car systems. Uber and such have inched into this territory, but you make it so efficient, once again, nobody needs to pay for it. And you get off the grid of the market system step by step to the highest degree you possibly can. And you eventually end up, ideally, probably not, and I know that people have a hard time with this, you eventually end up with a world, or at least a society, that has absolutely no need for money. You have labor systems that are completely different, like time banks. These are primitive concepts that can be built out where people no longer exchange with currency. They have a system of computation that creates value, where you have credit systems that are non-exchangeable, that allow you to do work with each other, but without the use and the incentive of money and profit. You start with cooperatives, with the corporation structure. If you wanted to do that, you work with that as best you can. Eventually, you won't need eventually you'll actually, I take that back. The cooperatives are fine in a transitional step. But I think what's eventually going to happen is you're going to have hubs of technological production in various areas, such as here in Culver City, where people design and they create in an open source way. Whether you design a phone or a car, technology that we have now through CAD systems, you can literally design an entire car and crash it into something, and the physics of it will articulate exactly what's going to happen. And you take that design mechanism with a community-driven, literally a democratic economy where people are creating together, and then you have a very advanced system of production that's localized, that produces these things through I'd say 3D printing variations, where you have highly modular production methods. You simplify all goods, so you have standardization. I mean, look at the ridiculousness of what we do with these companies that create proprietary stuff. Nothing's standardized. The huge piles of electronic waste throughout the world is largely because shit isn't standardized. So people can't create compatibility. Not to mention, nothing's designed to be recycled at all. Nothing from the design stage. You re-engineer all of that. You have protocols built into these design systems that force the individual, because of the AI intelligence that we can now put forward, to not produce anything that isn't recyclable by design. So I can go on and on, but you see where I'm getting at here. There's a whole method that can be done to eliminate the structural flaws of this system. That kind of approach will incrementally also help with the pollution problems and everything else naturally. But I would say the caveat is there still needs to be some kind of, and this is a deviation from my point, some kind of larger activism against the industry too, because of the severity on the global level of the pollution and ecological crisis. So this incremental process is what needs to be done, but simultaneously there needs to be activism on that level to really stifle, and that's where the mass protests and things need to happen. And I encourage that. So anyway, I deviated from my point there, but I hope you get what I'm saying.
No, but well, it's all connected. I mean,
Yeah.
it's one of those things that, you and I both know. It's great that we do everything we can as individuals, but at the end of the day, that's about 3% of
Right.
the problems. And these major polluters in the world, the Amazons and Walmarts of the world, if nothing's done about them.
Yeah, I know. And that's
Well,
why the localization process was able to move forward. The incentives would shift, and I think eventually these companies would cease to exist. That's basically what you're doing. You're eroding from the inside. And I know it sounds real slow and difficult, but I'm working on this, and eventually try to create an actual network system that comprises all of this, that someone can have on their phone as an app. And it's the beginning stages of all of this, where people are literally going out of their way not to engage commerce and industry. And what do you do when that happens if you don't do it that way? Excuse me. What do you do when that happens? It drops GDP. It starts to stifle the system. What a powerful form of activism it would be to literally create economic decline, coercing the society to finally change structurally. Does that make sense?
no, it absolutely does. I mean, it's one of those things where it sounds, as you put it too, very, very radical, of
Sure.
this idea of like, well, what if we just built a complete viable alternative?
Mm-hmm.
But it's not an impossibility,
Yeah.
especially when our government has made it clear to us via this pandemic that it's not just we're not a priority, we're not an afterthought.
Yeah. Yeah. No,
So it's like,
the sickness is palpable. It's like a caste system. I think that's the best way to put it. Instead of looking at lower, middle class and so on, it's really a caste system of power, and it's ultimately two tiers. A socialistically rich group that does whatever they want, has infinite access, that is rigged in their favor. In my last podcast, I talked about the financial system in Wall Street and QE and the bailouts. This is just the top tier folks getting everything they can get for themselves, and whatever happens for the rest of the population is exactly what you said, an afterthought, the trickle down and all of that. So yeah, I couldn't agree more. And then people need to, I don't support hostility and anger, but I really feel like there is a class war, and it needs to be treated like a war on a certain level. And the best ammunition we have is to simply not participate anymore And technology, luckily, is now enabling that to a degree. Buckminster Fuller coined a phrase called ephemeralization. It's the ability to do more and more and more with less and less and less. That is the true economic wealth that we have. That's the true core of our social integrity, is to be able to do something without any impact, ideally, on the environment or negative retroactions whatsoever. And that's where we're going towards. And that's why I think this kind of solution I just brought up makes sense, because you will have the ability to create industrial systems that are small and refined and sustainable, that have incredible outputs that don't require thousands of corporations, if strategically done through standardization and all the things I just spoke of.
So let's get to localization for a bit, because I too am a big fan of this, and I talk a lot about just the idea of like a public bank. I know you're going a lot further beyond that, but just that in the short term, the idea of a public bank, the idea of people cooperating more to get the goods and services they need in a community and focus on that community. But one of the roadblocks that I kind of hit when I kind of break down this stuff is you do still have a lot of disparity within different communities in the United States, especially. I mean, we can use ourselves as an example here in Los Angeles. How do you go about solving that problem so you don't have a scenario where some communities have a lot, whereas other communities are completely left out and have nothing?
I'm sorry, I kind of misunderstood you. You're referring to with the addition of a public bank, or just in general?
Just in general. I mean, public bank was just one of the, for instances, I was throwing in there, but just in general, how do you kind of prevent that from happening?
I think the networking of communities would solve that problem in the same way that the early evolution of this kind of system did. There are positive features to how this kind of economy evolved, but it's run its course. So, it was natural for communities to be localized back in the day. They didn't have any other means. They grew their own stuff. Then finally they had, their participants, and then they had other communities parallel. And if they got along, then they would share and trade. That's how this network has flourished. And with good positivity on certain levels, there's something to be said for specialization and stuff like that. But I think, to answer your question, is really quite simple. I mean, if you have in Los Angeles, Culver City, you have a parallel area, Santa Monica, and there's a deficiency in Santa Monica, and there's a surplus in Culver City, why would they not want to help each other? And ultimately, the network really wouldn't be isolated anyway. They would still be working together through other means. The resources are unequally distributed on the planet. It's not like people can just be localized. There's a fundamental understanding that society has to share. I mean, that's what globalization pretends to be, right? Except it's not. It's an exploitative process for labor and resources and all the angling that goes into it. So I think Gandhi had the best view. That's kind of what I based this idea on. He hated industrialization, and he talked a great deal about the problems of what we've done to society with the compartmentalization and how nation states become competitors against others, because again, it's economic competition, whether it's a corporation or a nation. And he talked about overlap in oceanic circles, I believe is how he phrased it, and how it's very important for people to be localized and have the highest integrity possible, but there is an overlap with all the other communities in the event there's a problem. And I think that's the best philosophical view. In the end, a global society that has a worldview of actually caring for itself and being sustainable, I think would gravitate towards this logic as well. They would gravitate towards having empathy because they would see it's in their own self-interest to actually make sure the people next to you are actually doing well. Because if they're not doing well, we all know what happens when two groups of people, one does well and one doesn't, and they aren't going to collaborate. With someone's going to invade some other group. So there's a fundamental incentive, I think, that needs to be understood to create peace on this planet and sustainability. And if we can get that education across, it takes care of itself. That's just the way we need to be. If we can't be that way, well, then we might as well just shoot all of us just shoot ourselves in the head right now. This whole argument that this is just the way people are, and I'm sorry to jump on the point here, but I run into this all day long, and people are like, oh, well, this is just human nature, or we're groupistic. Yeah, we are kind of groupistic. It's true. It's in our biology. We gravitate towards that. And yeah, we have apprehensions in our brain and our wiring, our lower limbic system. It's actually been proven that when people see someone that doesn't look like them, if they haven't been if they haven't experienced that as a child, they will have a fired antagonism. The same thing happens with people in baseball teams. They'll show these people images of their team they like, and they throw in a team they don't like, and they have this antagonistic response in their brain firing automatically. So we do have that problem. But anyone who falls back on that and says, well, this is just the way we are and there's no hope, then all they're saying is that we're designed to go extinct, because the future right now is not going to be the end of the planet. It's going to be a completely destabilized society from the ecological crisis and the inequality crisis that results not only in domestic communities, but also in the international community, because the international inequality is just as caustic as inside of a domestic society. And it's going to create just crazy amounts of chaos and violence and war and destruction. That is where we're headed. Noam Chomsky always reminds people about nuclear war. And everyone's like, well, we haven't talked about that in a long time. And he's absolutely right. These weapons are sitting right there. And all it takes is a particular spark when one nation gets extremely fearful about the integrity of their society. So anyway, I can keep rambling. But
well, I mean, you totally just went into what I was going to ask next, because my next question was going to be, do you think we can have this type of societal shift peacefully?
I think if it's done in the way I recommended, with voluntary participants that come in and they get off the grid, we work together to create advanced systems, building inside the current infrastructure, effectively eroding it. What will happen if that took hold? So let's imagine people stopped using money and they went into advanced time bank systems and they engineered their own resources and so on, as I've spoken of before. The state would lose its mind, because their power system would be eroded due to the fact that no one's using the commerce system, all the taxation stuff, the very idea that people would not be bound anymore to the architecture of the power and economic system would probably result in a huge backlash eventually from state power, whether outlawing this kind of thing. Like in Florida, they outlawed people being off the grid. They claimed it was a public health thing. I think it was because of lobbyists. Literally, you can't in Florida be off the grid with solar panels and things like that. They force you to be connected. I think that's a lobbying issue. So to me, the main violence would come from the state after a certain point, and the corporate structure. You'd have the lobbyists lose their mind and go to the state power would intervene legally, and then people would become upset. And yeah, they might fight back. They might do things that could create such tension. That's kind of the way I'd see it happen. Yeah. Unless, of course, well, no, I'm not going to go on that tangent. Sorry.
To be continued.
I'm really tired. So if I just, go. Yeah.
Are you okay if we take a couple viewer questions?
Oh, please.
A lot of people are excited to see you, man. So we got a few questions. First of all, the Coxman Archives. Thank you very much for the Super Chat contribution. You keep this show on the air. And they say, congratulations, Peter Joseph. Looking forward to watching the film tonight, which, before I let you go, you're going to tell everyone where they can catch the film. Dan Campbell, what's up? Thank you very much for the Super Chat contribution. Heavy question here. Why can't we just accept our own demise gracefully and let some other species take over in a million years? ? Sheesh, have some consideration for our billionaires. They aren't built to deal with sustainable environments.
I know, the poor billionaires. They're such an oppressed minority, aren't they?
You have not brought up through the course of this interview, Peter, what poor Jeff Bezos is going to do in this society where what's he going to do? He's got to go to space.
Yeah, that's another thing. These people that are so behind Elon Musk and all this engineering to go to space and Mars, what do they think they're going to gain from any of that? It's not going to help the general population. It's just flaunting expression by ambitious billionaires for their own ego and historical memory. If anyone's going to be going to space and Mars, it's not going to be anyone but the billionaires and super wealthy. So anyway, that's another conversation.
Well, it totally is. And you touched upon it earlier when you were saying about how, the accumulation of wealth brings about this like psychopathy and sociopathy. And it's very evident, because if you had $1 billion and you really wanted to help the climate, there's a long list of things you could do with those types of resources. A long list.
Oh,
I mean, even one of the quote nicer billionaires like Tom Steyer. It's like, if that guy really wanted to help the climate, the last thing he would do is run for president. There are a million other things he could do with those types of resources. Yep. Yet you have these people that have the resources, and they're like, we're going to colonize space. Yeah. We're going to go look for some cheap alien labor.
Yep.
It's just insane.
No, you hit it. You hit the nail on the head. All you have to do is look at these outrageous resources being hoarded by these people And then look at what they do with it. They create their little charities and their tax loopholes, and they give a lot of lip service to poverty and so on. I mean, in my film, InterReflections, I have a character that wins a lottery, a fictional lottery, and he wins the biggest lottery of the time, a couple decades from now, $15 billion. And he decides to solve homelessness in Los Angeles, his hometown. And he gets the Nobel Peace Prize. So I have this scene where he's giving this speech, and he says at the very end that the billionaires of our world are not symbols of success, they are symbols of violence. And he's talking about how he has to end his program because none of the billionaires are helping him at all. He's the only one that has ever tried to solve, which could be done, by the way. 75,000 homeless in Los Angeles. Yeah, you could easily create with a couple $1 billion of billionaires funding it, I should say, over the course of time, nice institutional systems to get these people off the street and the medical help that they need. They don't do it. It kind of surprises me, frankly. You'd think at least the egos of these guys would want to be a savior, right? You think they'd at least want to do it to make themselves look like they're the best person in the world. But they don't. They still don't do it. It's just incredible to me. Where's the last thing that you saw an actual super wealthy person do directly? I'm not talking about charities. I'm not talking about Bill Gates and the nonsensical philanthropist pact where everybody arbitrarily agrees to give away all their money when they die to some other charity, which is probably just another tax haven loophole. And by the way, and one other thing I'll comment, and the arrogance as well, especially with the Gates Foundation, is they transcend state authority and any kind of democratic process. These guys go into nations with their stupid amounts of money and affect them without any democratic participation whatsoever. It's like a dictatorship of the billionaire philanthropists. And they do it purposefully. Bill Gates has actually said that he doesn't want to give money to the government because he doesn't think the government has the role it should. Well, the government does suck. Yeah, the governments around the world, especially in the United States, are horrible. But the reason they're horrible is because no one's trying to help them. The people that run the government are so libertarian, they don't even believe in the idea of government. I mean, literally, the president of the United States doesn't even believe in government. That's why when the COVID thing happened, he refused to do that whole nationalization process, whatever it was called, where he conscripts industry. He did it eventually, but he tried to bring on corporations. Remember that big list of commercial corporations he went through, describing how they were contributing to this? He's literally circumventing the idea that government should do anything. He said, only private enterprise. That's the religion of private enterprise. And it's really destructive. It's unfortunate that we can't understand. I mean, government is management. People shouldn't say, I hate the state. That's saying you hate yourself. That's saying that you're hating the entire idea that there should be participatory democracy at all, that there should be any decision making. You have defined, you are ultimately what this institution is going to be and do if it actually worked. And I could talk a great deal as to why that doesn't work, of course, with the structure of capitalism and so on. But I think everyone gets the idea.
Oh, I think our government, I mean, they just figured out. I mean, it's so ironic. We have such a horrible work culture in the United States, but our government, they really figured it out big time. We are lawmakers who do not believe in making laws. See you later. We're going on our 5th vacation of the year.
Yep. The neoliberal
makes sense.
Yeah, the neoliberal disease. And that's another thing about this evolution. People need to look at it as a spiral staircase. It's not that you can just revert back at this point. Neoliberalism has polluted the entire planet. The idea of privatization, the idea of basically just promoting big businesses and corporations and private enterprise in general. And it's going to continue getting worse. We've already reached that trajectory. There's no going back unless we start radical change. In other words, people that talk about, I'm a big fan of a lot of people that are more conservative, I should say. Professor Wolf is a great mind in terms of the kind of core socialist values. He refers to himself as a socialist, or Bernie Sanders, but they're still, in my mind, I'm not trying to be insulting, they're still locked in the idea that they can make the changes they propose within the current model, as if we are still in a place where that's going to be supported. And I know some may disagree with that. There's a reason why the United States is so much different and doesn't have, say, healthcare for all versus Europe or the Scandinavian countries, which are the most successful. That's because there's different paths and trajectories that have happened in the development of these nations and their cultures and their power system, that where they are in the power hierarchy on the global level. So to expect the United States to just kind of superimpose Scandinavian social policies is absolutely preposterous. The U.S. is far too messed up, not only in its culture. I mean, literally, you have whole huge swaths of people, undereducated people. Again, I'm not trying to be insulting, that believe in their own oppression. Literally, they support the systems that oppress them and keep them poor because they think that's freedom, and that's part of the crisis of consciousness we have in this country.
But do you think, I mean, are there still possibilities for some, shifts in policy
Yeah.
if there is enough pressure? I think like, and again, I have my criticisms of all electoral politics big time, but I think when you're talking about someone like a Bernie Sanders and even someone like a Richard Wolff, who are in two different lanes, they're
Mhm.
still kind of working within those lanes they're occupying.
Yeah, and I don't put them down for doing that. I say it's just not enough. I say
Hmm.
there has to be a deeper plan here. If we can get finally, universal healthcare in America, that's great. It seems like it's an inevitability eventually,
Hmm.
maybe. I mean, but look at how long this has been talked about. I mean, I'm just looking at what's really happening and the trends that I see, and I can't help but say that having core the core focus being on how to influence government to create policy for the better it's just not enough.
Sure.
That's all.
Well, do you think we need, because I would say, which I think kind of piggybacks on that. The thing though is we need everybody to occupy the different lanes. Like I kind of break it down where it's like we have reformers, which is somebody like, say, a Bernie Sanders or any politician that is trying to use electoral politics to do their part to shift the status quo.
Mhm.
We have reformers and then we have revolutionaries. And, you can be one or the other. It doesn't make you any better or worse, but we kind of need each other. A reformer can't be effective without the revolutionaries. The revolutionaries still need the reformers to kind of whittle away at things until we get to the place where we all want to be. Would you agree with that or no?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I don't know how anyone would disagree. There is a synergy there because, as I said earlier, we have to work on multiple levels. But I would say the reformers are not really reformers, though. I mean, Martin
Mm,
Luther King had the best statement. He said towards the end of his life, I am going to have to paraphrase, I've spent my life, thinking we can have, incremental change here and there, and we can move along in this way, and then progress will be inevitable. And today I feel differently. We need a total restructuring of our society. And I think, he was a reformer, even though he didn't live long enough to really put in the poverty system, the poverty, the economic bill of human rights that he was putting forward. Before he got shot, he was going to have a huge march in Washington to force universal basic income. And, this was true reformer at the time. And universal basic income, of course, with Yang, I completely agree. It would be great to have universal basic income to help people out of poverty now, but that is a very small patch in the huge scope of other problems, and ultimately will not do anything to help the consumption patterns of this type of economy, and so on and so on and so on. A true reformer, I would say, it has to be radical. But I agree. Once again, I don't like to alienate people by going on this tangent. I'm saying these things that are so radical and say that nothing else is going to work. But I do encourage people to think about it and to really go step by step down the process of what's going to be required to do two things: create ecological balance with our habitat and reduce socioeconomic inequality, which is the largest driver of human division on the face of the earth. It's literally the antithesis of our inherent psychology. We're not designed, as I put in my film, there's no evidence to show that humans are designed to be hierarchical. In fact, it creates worse public health for us. We are not bonobos or chimpanzees. Well, bonobos actually have very limited hierarchy. We're not chimpanzees. We are not baboons. We are not limited by this extremely primitive lower brain reality where we have no other. We have consciousness to a degree. That's what makes humans different from the other primate species. Nothing is inevitable if we can really think about it and draw awareness to that fact, as Marshall McLuhan once said. So,
mm.
anyway.
I read him a lot in grad school. Jason wants to know, what do you do about ego? Ironically enough, that was the next question.
Oh, ego
It's broad. It's broad. But what do you do about ego?
Well, I think ego is a defense mechanism response, and I think ego is extremely amplified in its neuroses in the current system because everyone has a reputation. They need a reputation to get a job. They need a basic respect that comes from the cultures of the system. So, ego is right up there with having lots of money. It's right up there with having ownership and property. So I think the egoism stems from that fundamental insecurity. And it's not really ego. Anyone that's really boasting about themselves narcissistically, if it's not just a clinical disorder like like with Trump, they're basically just projecting their own insecurity. That's what I find when people are really egotistical. I mean, that's a deep psychological conversation, but
Totally.
I'll just leave it at that.
Peter, where can everybody watch the movie tonight?
So it's on a whole smattering of on-demand cable and on-demand internet. You can go to InterReflectionsMovie.com. I'm getting all these links updated, but the list that people can search for is currently on the website. If they go to watch InterReflectionsMovie.com, all the standards. You got the YouTube, you got Vimeo, you got Vudu, you have Amazon Prime. I use the traditional distributor with this, so of course I'm in bed with the devil as usual. But you just can't operate with this kind of production without it getting out there. It's more important to me that people see it in a professional environment, and as opposed to just me releasing it myself. So yeah.
So that's InterReflectionsMovie.com. That's where people can go.
InterReflectionsMovie.com, exactly.
Brilliant. Peter, thank you so much for doing this. Coxman Archives, Dan, Jason, thank you so much for the Super Chat contributions. You keep this show on the air. Peter, awesome talking to you. Again, everybody, reflectionsmovie.com. We'll be back for a full live stream next week. No show tomorrow because I have another college gig that I'll be doing from my living room in this quarantine time. But I'll see you guys next Monday. InterReflectionsMovie.com. Check it out. I highly recommend it. In the meantime, you know the drill. Lucy says meow. I say